I was asked to just do maybe a quick talk about an issue of my own choosing, and I suppose I really enjoy church history. Church history was what led me to become Lutheran, actually, far back when I was still discerning. I converted to Christianity in my late teenage years and struggled quite a bit with the different traditions we have available across the board. And for a long time, I attended Mass at a Roman Catholic church and really enjoyed that. Met a lot of wonderful, good people, some of whom, well, quite a few of whom I'm still good friends with today. But I do suppose that what settled me towards a path different than the one going to Rome was my study of church history. And instead of just droning on for half an hour, I think I'll just do maybe a 10, 12 minutes long presentation of what I take to be a interesting case study of church history, because I really dislike it when people come with off-the-cuff remarks, appeals to like the unanimous consensus of the church fathers, because I mean, while those appeals are very easy to make and might have some rhetorical power to them, then it's actually quite a difficult task to seek to establish what it means for something to be a unanimous consensus among the church fathers. And you can use years studying just single topics. You might be unable to exhaust the source material fully. For example, if you have a very broad scope and want to find out like what is the Christology of the early church, you can spend a lifetime studying that. So at times I think it can be quite helpful to do a case study. So that is not to say that if we study, say, as I will try and go through today, namely the question of papal authority and papal jurisdiction in North Africa in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century. So here we have a quite limited scope. So I think it's actually possible to say something intelligible and something meaningful in a short duration of time. Because if you want to say like, let's examine the papal claims, then you would need to write a, I don't know, 600-page large book on the topic, as some people have done, because such a broad topic just warrants a deep discussion. But here today, I just want to try and test the papal claims with this one historical case study, namely the North African case. So first, I think it would be helpful for us to consider the papal claims, because the papal claims here regarding the office of the papacy, that is to say, that there is a divinely instituted office that is permanent and has continually existed at least since Christ bestowed it upon Saint Peter, who has handed that on in a direct line of succession from one man to the other, all the way back to Christ himself. And that within this one office, there is a supreme jurisdictional authority over all the churches, all the members of the churches, and that is warranted both over clergy and laity. So I think these are quite a fair and unbiased presentation of the essence of the papal claims. And I think it's helpful to underscore the importance of the role of St. Peter and Christ himself, because those are the claims made by Pastor Aeternus, that is the decree made by the First Vatican Council defining these papal claims. Because today in the online sphere, you will often see that people will try to appeal to the to Cardinal Newman's theory of the development of doctrine to explain, or at least give a more plausible explanation of the papal claims as something that was a position either slowly being acknowledged as church history passed on, or something that developed where only the seeds, the kernel, the abstract truths of the office were directly apostolic, and they grew in, germinated, and came into a fullness of exercise only centuries later. And I think that's impossible actually to defend such a view of the papacy, because this is not a doctrine. This is not something that comes to be understood more as time passes, but rather it is something that is an office. It's an actual position made and founded by Christ himself immediately, and handed off a sort of stewardship. And if this is an office, it must have existed, and the claims must have been attached to that office ever from the beginning. So that all having been said, then let's explore that and how that fits with the case of North Africa, because St. Augustine has always been a particular interest of mine. So that, of course, naturally leads to some studying of the context, the history of his area, of the generations past and those following him. Oh yeah, also a last point on the role and nature of the papacy. If the papal claims of Rome are true, then apart from, indeed, in addition to Rome having the supreme jurisdiction and authority over the church, we would also have to say that very unity with the church itself is conditional on unity with the Pope himself. That is to say that unity and communion with the Pope, with the episcopacy of Rome, is the thing that constitutes or enables community with the visible church. That's also a very important point. Okay, so how credible are these claims then? Yeah, so if Jesus created such an office with these capabilities, then we can't really appeal to the idea of doctrinal development, because if Saint Peter was invested with such a office, and if he was conscious of such an office with these privileges, then we can't imagine that he would somehow fail in his task of passing on this office, its authority, and the privileges exercised by it to his immediate successors. So, because this would be the chief guardian against strife, struggles with heretics and schisms. So if this were the case, then we must see this somehow being carried on. And that is not to say that we need like 1st or 2nd century sources like explicitly explaining it, but let's see how these claims are able to explain the historical facts that we experienced later on. One of the big early controversies of the Western Church was the controversy between Saint Cyprian in North Africa. He was the Bishop of Carthage, the chief city, the provincial capital, we might say, of North Africa, and the Bishop of Rome, who lived at the same time, Saint Stephen of Rome, and they were in a strong disagreement regarding the nature of baptism. So Saint Cyprian had experienced that baptism done by heretics or former apostate Christians who had apostatized and later come back to the faith created quite a bit of scandal in the church. And now this is a true interesting doctrinal disagreement, because here we are forced to ask the deep questions of what or why or how are sacraments valid within the church? Are the sacraments valid and effectuous because of the personal holiness or sanctity or faithfulness of the priest or pastor carrying them out? Or are the sacraments effectuous because of the promises of God? And this disagreement ripped apart the North African church from the Roman Italian church at this point, because there was a firm disagreement here. So the North African Archbishop Cyprian said that you can't have valid sacraments if the priest's faith is false, or if the priest's faith is not an expression of an actual living, saving faith. And here we see that that even though Christianity at large would side with the Bishop Stephen of Rome, then the interesting question here regarding our inquiry is that here we have a strong doctrinal divide between the Italian and North African church. And what is interesting here is that all of North Africa sided with Cyprian and actually broke communion with Rome, with the Italian church, and they remained for quite a while disunited. And this is very curious because this is one of the earliest examples. It might not be the earliest examples, but it is one of the earliest examples where we actually have a really the rubber hits the road situation where the papal claims are put to the test in an actual case study. So if it were the case that unity with the Church of Christ was contingent on the unity with Rome, if it were the case that it is part of the apostolic deposit of faith, that it is necessary to submit to the Roman pontiff, that is the Bishop of Rome, and if it were believed that he had the supreme ecclesiastical jurisdictions, if he was infallible with regard to official proclamations of faith and morals, then it would be inconceivable to imagine that the whole church province, we are talking about maybe 200 to 300 bishops, breaking communion with Rome, siding with Saint Cyprian, unless we are to imagine that they either are one or ignorant of the papal claims, and that would really challenge the claim of them being apostolic and part of the deposit of faith, or secondly, that they all, in addition to schism, also went into heresy. But this last appeal, that the whole North African church just went into heresy, is also quite a extreme or desperate explanation of the facts, because could we imagine something similar for other important doctrines of the faith? For example, many of us might be aware of the charge of Arianism as a theological movement in the early church, that when the priest Arius from Alexandria posited that the Son was a created being rather than eternal God, then at once, like within just a few years, many books, pamphlets, etc. were published against him, and he was charged with heresy, and there was an open fight within the church. But we don't see that in North Africa. We don't see that at all, actually, which is quite interesting, because that would really challenge the notion that this was part of the apostolic deposit. Because it's not just the case that Cyprian himself rejected the authority of Bishop Stephen of Rome and his ability to mingle within North African affairs. He called General Council of Africa in 258, I believe, and there they decreed, all the bishops, that no bishop can have authority or jurisdiction over another. So here we actually have a conciliar declaration refuting the papal claims. Of course, I would say that it would be anachronism to talk about papal claims this early, but here we see at least what would later suffice to be a rejection of the papal claims. And in the Seventh Council of Carthage, this General Synod of North Africa in 258, we read that, quote, "It remains that upon this same matter each of us should bring forward what we think, judging no man, nor rejecting any one from the rite of communion, if he should think differently from us. For neither does any of us set himself up as a bishop of bishops, nor by tyrannical terror does any compel his colleague to the necessity of obedience, since every bishop, according to the allowance of his liberty and power, has his own proper right of judgment, and can no more be judged by another than he himself can be judge of another. So here we find a conciliar declaration of the North African province defining and declaring a theology of episcopal collegiality, that you might have a prima inter pares, foremost bishop by honor, just as Saint Cyprian led the North African bishops, but we find it also that he couldn't wield any jurisdictional authority above and beyond those. Now, just to go forward a bit in time, around 150 years later, because we might say that maybe of course, Cyprian was just wrong. Maybe all of North Africa just fell into heresy and error here in this period. But let's see then at the reception of this view of episcopal authority, because it's my claim that we actually have this strain of thought surviving for quite a while within North Africa. Around 150 years later, St. Augustine was active in North Africa, and he was a great admirer of St. Cyprian. And this placed him, that is St. Augustine, in a great dilemma, because on the one hand, St. Augustine actually agreed with the doctrine of Pope Stephen, but he did not want to condemn St. Cyprian. So doctrinally, he agreed about the view of baptism that was found within Rome and disagreed with Cyprian's view, but he actually agreed with the ecclesiology of Saint Cyprian and wanted to follow him in that he was right to take his direction. So, well, then, how did Saint Augustine then dissolve this controversy? Well, St. Augustine appealed to the fact that this controversy was actually never settled during St. Cyprian's lifetime, and that had it been settled during the lifetime of St. Cyprian, then surely he would have come around to the correct view. And this is very interesting, because in the mind of St. Augustine, you would need to have an ecumenical council to settle this doctrinal question, because according to St. Augustine, the Bishop of Rome's judgment was not able to settle this question. It didn't carry the authority. The Bishop of Rome, though being a very important bishop with the highest honors and with great weight and authority, did not have any jurisdictional authority surpassing the other bishops of the empire. So even though Stephen excommunicated and judged in this doctrinal matter, his verdict was insufficient to settle the question according to Saint Augustine. And he writes about this in his book on baptism, book 1, chapter 18, where he writes, quote, "And yet, if within the church different men still held different opinions on the point, without meanwhile violating peace, then till someone clear and simple decree should have been passed by an universal council," that is to say, an ecumenical council, "it would have been right for the charity which seeks for unity to throw a veil over the error of human infirmity. For it is written, for charity shall cover a multitude of sins." There are great proofs of this existing on the part of the blessed martyr Cyprian, in his letters to come at last to him of whose authority they carnally flatter themselves they are possessed with, whilst by this love of his are spiritually overthrown. For at that time, before the consent of the whole church had declared authoritatively by the decree of a plenary council what practice should be followed in this matter, it seemed to him, in common with about 80 of his bishops, that it was not settled. So here we see that, according to St. Augustine, the judgment or verdict of the Pope does not suffice to settle the question. Rather, St. Cyprian was right to refrain from following the judgment of the Pope, because there had not yet been any plenary council to settle the matter. that is very interesting, because here we see that even in his capacity of public teacher, the Bishop of Rome did not have the authority to correct errors of other bishops. And this again is not only seen within the writings of Saint Augustine. He also talks more about it later in the second book of his work on baptism, chapter 2. But also, they called a General Council of North Africa in 426, which enumerated and expanded on the earlier General Council of North Africa of 418, where they banned any appeals by clergy across the sea. This term, transmarine, means is a technical term, but it just means that when different ecclesiastical or doctrinal cases were brought up and had to be settled, it was illegal for clergymen to appeal their case to doctors, bishops, or ecclesiastical courts across the sea. That would be across the Mediterranean Sea to Italy, for example. And here we also have the sense of the canons of Sardica, which tried to set up an appeal system in the early church, kind of like how, let's say, how the American listeners know that you have local courts, you might have state courts, and then you have the Supreme Court on top, and you can appeal your case upwardly in the jurisdictional system. Now, the North African General Synod forbade this multiple times because, again, we see that the ecclesiology of the early church was not that you had some, let's say, local court, ecclesiastical court in your local church, and then you might have a provincial court, let's say in Carthage or in Alexandria or Jerusalem. And then you had the Supreme Court in Rome, kind of how the Roman ecclesiastical system is nowadays. But rather, they forbade this practice because, according to their understanding of ecclesiology, the local churches were independent, and they actually had the authority to refrain from and disallow this practice, which also presupposes that they rejected any understanding of one church, one patriarchate having supreme jurisdictional authority throughout all the churches. Say, in this case, that would be the context would be the wanting of Rome to exercise jurisdictional authority over North Africa and to be able to exercise the power to adjudicate controversies and disagreements in the North African Church. And we see that a huge controversy with the monk, the English monk Pelagius, during the last period of St. Augustine's lives. But regardless, so maybe this was a bit more than 15 minutes, but this is just to say that I think this small case study is just like one very confined but also very clear example of how the papal claims as defined by the First Vatican Council in the 19th century are foreign and incompatible with the actual evidence and practices of the early church, at least here in the case of the province of North Africa in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century of the church.